my marching orders were particularly three things. One was to keep China committed to the G20 process. So if you remember, it was right around that time that the G20 process became a leaders meeting, and
Yes.
Geithner really wanted to keep China involved in that. And then Treasury had an interest in that work I had just been doing, encouraging China to continue to build up domestic demand and move away from over-reliance on external demand. And then the third thing is that all the important micro issues of market access, IPR, those issues are handled by the Commerce Department of the US, USTR, Department of Agriculture. We were sort of a mediator between those departments of the US and the Chinese. Treasury's interest was getting China to take those issues seriously, but then also getting the US side to be realistic. I would say the US brought at times two different approaches. And one approach is arguing to the Chinese that their undervalued exchange rate and their big surplus, that would be 2005, 2006, 2007, arguing that that was really harming the US economy and that it was important to us for them to change that. And I feel like that argument never got anywhere, partly because the Chinese side had plenty of good economists who would look at this and say, well, this isn't going to make a big effect on the US economy. The other approach, was to argue that this was actually quite damaging to the Chinese economy. So I had been arguing since I arrived in 2004 that it was a mistake for them to let the currency get undervalued. It forced them to have very conservative fiscal policy to avoid inflation, and they ended up underinvesting in infrastructure and social services. And so I always argued they were hurting themselves. It's hard to imagine all-out war between China and the United States now that we have nuclear weapons. So, the world has changed a lot in a couple thousand years. But there's inevitably going to be tension, perhaps even proxy wars. So we've got some national security issues that are very serious. You've got China expanding in the South China Seas, putting pressure on some of our allies like South Korea because of their security issues, their security relations with us. So I think taking that national security threat seriously has to be one part of US-China relations. But then it's hard to imagine working on global climate change, pandemic control, nuclear nonproliferation in Iran, North Korea. I just can't see the world dealing with these issues unless China and the US are cooperating. So if I have to give a yes/no answer to that, I would say no. The exchange, the trade, and the investment, these are largely win-win relationships. America benefits a lot by its trading and investing with China, but of course it has distributional implications. So as China joined the WTO, had a big export boom in the 2000s, there were a couple of million US manufacturing jobs that were eliminated fairly quickly. But the most recent research shows that there were an equivalent amount of jobs, typically better jobs in the service sectors employing more highly educated people. But we had already trends toward inequality, and I would say the China trade exacerbated that. There's a lot of economic integration between the US and China. And more importantly, each of us is deeply integrated in the same world system. If we try to isolate China, we'd have to bring all our partners along, and I don't think they're going to follow us. There's not that much financial integration between the US and China, but the current trends are disturbing. So I think the Senate voted unanimously on this bill that will end up delisting Chinese companies from American stock markets. I think financially that's probably not that important. You're talking about 156 companies, and they have multiple listings, so they're available in Hong Kong, probably in London. But it's a bad, it's a bad sign, and we don't know how the Chinese are going to respond to that. So I would say the financial integration is at an early stage, and now to be cutting it off is definitely risky. There's enormous benefits in cooperative research and technology development, which is happening. All kinds of examples. American companies are expanding their research labs in China. And then I think there are some genuine national security issues. So the trick is to wall off a small number of technologies that have military application. What Hank Paulson calls, have a small yard with high fences, and then leave everything else open. That, to me, that's the ideal. And I think if we don't do that, we're definitely going to cut into our innovation and our future prosperity. There are some American companies that are doing very well in China. You've got General Motors gets about half its worldwide profits from China. You've got some successes that like to keep quiet and fly under the radar screen. Procter and Gamble, Johnson and Johnson. And then you've got companies, our social media companies completely shut out of China. So they're pretty angry and frustrated. And you've got a number of horror stories of companies that were doing very well in China and we're bullish about it, and then they really got pushed out. And I think part of the reason we're in this difficult situation with China is that the Chinese, with a modest amount of effort, could have been quite a bit more welcoming. Ten years ago, most of the direct investment into China was in the manufacturing sector. And some of that is aimed at the domestic market, like autos, but a lot of that was export oriented. But now it's flipped over, and the vast majority of foreign investment is in service sectors like financial services, telecom, healthcare is a big area. So I understand the frustration of investors who have difficulties they have to face, but in general, this is a growing and increasingly open market. So I thought it was smart that at this recent National People's Congress meeting, they did not put out an explicit target for this year, partly because they need 5.6 to reach their 10-year goal, and 5.6 is not credible. So, it's not like the Chinese Communist Party to put out a target they can't meet. And if you read their various documents carefully, you can back out that they expect real growth of 1.8%. They did put out a target to create 9 million urban jobs. And I think that, that's a signal that's an important part of social harmony there. And of course, if they succeed in that, that's going to make their growth number look better. Probably they're going to end up exceeding that 1.8%. They still have very good technocrats who are interested in openness, who understand that this is the future direction for China. I do think Liu He is a reformer, but recognizing he's a very senior member of the Communist Party in the Politburo, not the Standing Committee, but in the Politburo. But I think if you think of him as the point person on negotiation compared to previously, Wang Qishan, he's a bit of a favorite with Americans, but having been in a lot of meetings with him, I guess I'm not really convinced at heart he is a reformer or a truly market-oriented person. So I think that team of Liu He, Yi Gang, very Western educated, Fang Xinghai in the Securities Commission. So it may be a relatively small group, but I think they've got a high-quality group of technocrats. And they are interesting people who have to navigate the complex political world there. I think all of them would like to see more rapid reform, but they are certainly careful about what they say and what they write. By 2047, Hong Kong is probably going to be fully integrated into China. I don't think they'll rush to get rid of the currency, but at some point over the next 30 years, there will no longer be a Hong Kong dollar, and they're integrated into the yuan system. So we know the end game. My guess would be the transition will be gradual. You'll get firms not rushing to leave Hong Kong, but as they make personnel and renting decisions, the more Western-oriented firms will partially exit from Hong Kong. But then there are all these middle-class Chinese who would love to own an apartment in Hong Kong, and in the foreseeable future, they'll have the Hong Kong dollar and open capital account. So as Western-oriented interests exit, you'll get the wealthy Chinese moving more of their money and their children into Hong Kong, and they'll consider it a bastion of freedom compared to the mainland, and probably for the next 10 years or so, that'll be about right. So my guess is there'll be plenty of demand coming from mainland wealthy families while some Western exodus occurs. I think young people in Taiwan really do not feel affinity with the mainland. They identify more as Taiwanese than as Chinese. So I worry about what the end game is, because it's hard to imagine the people of Taiwan in any way accepting unification, basically. From the point of view of investors, probably there won't be any conflict for 10 years or more. But then, as you say, you could always have a mistake. I mean, you've got US and Chinese jets flying over Taiwan. You could have some kind of mistake that escalates into at least a small conflict. That in itself would be quite disastrous. As I see it, Iran is really a bad player in the world, and Russia is largely a bad player in the world. And I think China is kind of more up for grabs. So I don't think it's in our interest to push China. China and Russia have some mutual interests, but they don't really like each other. They're not obvious allies. I don't think it's in the US interest to push China into the arms of Russia. So that Iran, Russia, China coalition, I think that is something worth worrying about. So one more reason why we should be trying to have a more balanced relationship with China. The long-term vision of the United States is that China is integrated into world system, essentially a system that was built by the United States in particular at the end of World War II on the economic side. Ironically, China has the same vision, that they would like to be deeply integrated into this system. And then the difference is, we would like them to be integrated into the system we designed, and perhaps with changes that we would like the WTO to take on new disciplines, so that we want to make various changes, but we want to be in control. And the Chinese feel that they're a co-equal power. It's just hard to get the two to agree on what a reformed international system would look like. To me, that's really the big economic financial challenge: is can we design a system that both are satisfied with?